Isaiah chapter 31, verses 1 to 9. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or seek help from the Lord. Yet he too is wise and can bring disaster. He does not take back his words. He will rise up against that wicked nation, against those who help evildoers. But the Egyptians are the mere mortals and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, those who help will stumble. Those who are helpful will fall, and all will perish together. This is what the Lord says to me. As a lion growls, a great lion over its prey, and though a whole band of shepherds is called together against it, it is not frightened by their shouts or disturbed by their clamor. So the Lord Almighty will come down to do battle on Mount Zion and on its heights. Like birds hovering overhead, the Lord Almighty will shield Jerusalem, and he will shield it and deliver it. He will pass over it and rescue it. Return, you Israelites, to the one you have so greatly revolted against. For in that day every one of you will reject the idols of silver and gold your sinful hands have made. Assyria will fall by no human sword. A sword, not of mortals, will devour them. They will flee before the sword, and their young men will be put to forced labor. Their stronghold will fall because of terror, and the sight of the battle standard their commanders will panic, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, whose furnace is in Jerusalem.
Isaiah 32, verses 1 to 8. A king will reign in righteousness. Behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land. Then the eyes of those who see will not be closed, and the ears of those who hear will give attention. The heart of the hasty will understand and know, and the tongue of the stammerers will hasten to speak distinctly. The fool will no longer be called noble, nor the scoundrel said to be honourable. For the fool speaks folly, and his heart is busy with iniquity, to practice ungodliness, to utter error concerning the Lord, to leave the craving of the hungry unsatisfied, and to deprive the thirsty of drink. As for the scoundrel, his devices are evil. He plans wicked schemes, to ruin the poor with lying words, even when the plea of the needy is right. But he who is noble plans noble things, and on noble things he stands.
There are a few things in this country that raise more people to passion than sport. People get very excited about sport. This weekend, the town where I was born will be playing at Wembley in the playoff to see if they move up a division in the football competitions. Now that might seem a big enough occasion if you come from that town, but just to make it even bigger, they will be playing Sheffield Wednesday on that occasion. And for those who know Yorkshire, Barnsley and Sheffield are very close neighbours, and there is a huge rivalry. And whichever team that loses, there will be that temptation to run onto the pitch and try and hit the supporters of the other team. It has happened on a few occasions recently. not too far after that, there will be the FA Cup final, which is another big rivalry occasion because Manchester United will be playing Manchester City. Now, going back to Barnsley Football Club, Barnsley have only ever won the FA Cup once. I won't say in recent history, because it was in 1912, which is quite a while ago. And moving away from football on to the year 1912, can anybody tell me a significant historical event? Sorry, Pat.
Titanic.
The Titanic sunk in 1912. Don't believe everything you see in the movies, but there was such a ship that everybody said would never sink. And one of the stories that is a genuine story about that occasion is that there were musicians, a kind of a string quartet but slightly larger, who were playing, and when the news came that the mighty ship was going down, they changed what they were playing and they began to play the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." And they kept playing "Nearer, my God, to Thee" until as many people had been rescued as could possibly be rescued. And what Isaiah is trying to do here is almost a similar thing. He doesn't play hymns, but he speaks, and then his words are written down. And his message is that we should not depend on things other than God to keep us safe. We should depend on God, whatever the trouble might be. Not everybody who was on the Titanic came away safe and well. Many were drowned. But those who belong to God passed through the waters of trouble and found the heavenly kingdom. Those who relied entirely on the mighty ship that would never be sunk, and then encountered an iceberg that was bigger than itself, were lost in every sense of the word. And icebergs are peculiar things. I've never seen one. I don't ever intend to go out on a ship to those waters. But icebergs and swans and ducks have got things in common. What's that, Darren? You're winding us up now. No, I'm not. With swans and ducks, there's more going on under the surface than there is above the water. You'll see a swan gliding along the water looking peaceful and serene. But if you look under the water, its little legs are paddling furiously. How it managed to look so serene is something other. And with icebergs, there is more under the water than above the water. And that is something to understand, but hopefully never experience. So, when we look at this chapter this chapter and a half of Isaiah, we are tempted to say, well, why doesn't God help us today like he did in olden times? Why doesn't he send prophets? Well, one of the reasons is that nobody listened to the prophets. Another reason is that he sent his son. He came himself. And if we will not listen to Jesus, we will not listen to anyone. If we do not believe when a man is raised from the dead, how will we believe anything? And so there are many events in history. And one of the factors is that because God does not send prophets in the way that he did in old times, it is much more difficult for us to interpret what is happening. So, for example, a few years ago we had the pandemic. And at various points people said, this is a judgment from God. And then when the pandemic improved, people said we worried unnecessarily. And we have a tendency, particularly in the church, to make up theories about why certain things happen because we don't have prophets to listen to in the way that we did in olden times. You know, I like to think that there are some good things on YouTube. You can find some good preachers on YouTube. I saw one guy, very mysterious looking man, dressed all in black, long hair, dark glasses, but his message seemed to be solid. But there are some very wacky people out there on YouTube, and don't believe everything you hear. I met a lady the other day, Christian lady, who swallows everything wholesale. Don't go there. You will end up wrapping yourself in knots. And so we don't know why God allowed the pandemic, but we do know back in the day that when people, as we heard last week, were scurrying down to Egypt for help from Pharaoh, God said he would judge them. And he says in this passage in chapter 31 that everyone will perish together. That the good people who are trying to help will perish, and those who are bad will perish. And as Christians, sometimes we think, well, why doesn't God, if there's going to be a pandemic or some other major thing in society, why doesn't he kind of put a spiritual umbrella over the Christians and make things perfect for them? I really wouldn't want to imagine a world where Christians are so protected that we can't empathize with those who are sick. And the only way to empathize with those who are sick is if certain Christians are sick as well. We can stand alongside. And so, in this process, where all perish together, the ones who didn't entirely perish, if I can put it that way, are those who heard the admonition to be nearer, my God, to thee. Because when they went through trouble, they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, I'm kind of one of those grown-up kids. You know, I like cartoons. And my favourite cartoon in the whole world is Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. And one of the things is the scene where Wile E. Coyote has been trying to set a trap for Roadrunner. And you know it's never going to work, but the Roadrunner never gets caught. But there's one where he has set a trap on a train line. And just away from the train line there is a tunnel. And at the end of the tunnel there is a light. And he thinks maybe this is a good thing. What he doesn't know is that it is Roadrunner driving a train coming down the line, and he's the one in trouble. And so we would do well to reflect on our situation. We spend too much time reflecting on other people's situations. I've often commented that the least popular teaching of Jesus is the one where he says, do not judge. Because after we become Christians on the basis that we are wrongdoers, a little while further along the line, it is very easy to come to that point where we look down on others, because obviously God is with us. But God is looking for people who are humble. God is looking for people who are contrite, not only on the day that they come to know Jesus, but forever through their walk with Jesus. Now, usually in these passages in Isaiah, I have been dealing with them in whole chapters. And you might say, well, today, Darren, we have a whole chapter and a half chapter. Why is that? It's because the second half of the second chapter is Isaiah having a bit of a rant at women. And I didn't want to end my sermon today saying that women were complacent and not listening to God. So you'll get that bit next week. But like everything on this, it's kind of like if the hat fits or the cap fits, wear it. Isaiah doesn't address all women, but the women who are complacent. And you only can assess if you are complacent in your relationship to God. And God promised here at the beginning of chapter 32 that there would be a king who would reign in righteousness. I had an interesting discussion with a Christian lady from overseas the other day who said she'd watched the coronation. And isn't it a shame in this country that it's the Prime Minister that's in charge rather than the King? You have to be a very modern person to think that. But if you look back in British history at the times when the kings were in charge, then things were probably much worse most of the time. And if things were worse, you didn't get a chance to change it. You know, none of those days when you go along and vote and say, that guy, let's get rid of him. And we also have to remember that in our country, as opposed to many other countries, we never elect a single person. We elect a political party who choose one of their own to be the leader of the country. And we've seen in recent years how difficult that is to do effectively. We seemed at one point to have a new prime minister every third day, but that's probably me exaggerating. But here, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. Now, this wasn't the king of Israel in a political sense that was being predicted, because Israel, like our country, had a whole succession of kings, and very few of them did well. If you look through the annals of the kings of Israel, easy to say that David was the best. There were a few others who did okay. But in terms of the Bible, the one who had second most impact is Solomon. And we all know, I guess, if we know anything about Solomon's life, is that his life was a rather mixed affair. No pun intended. And so if you go through hundreds of years with only one righteous king, it is no surprise that God said, no more kings for Israel. It hasn't worked. He advised them not to have a king in the first place, but then they went ahead. So the king who is predicted here is one, the man who was God, Jesus, who reigns in righteousness. And it says rulers will rule with justice. Now this is difficult to understand, but it is interesting to find out in the New Testament that the number of disciples was 12. The same number as the tribes in the Old Testament. And in the book of Revelation, we are told that at the end of times, the disciples who served under Jesus will be seated on thrones. And these, in their turn there, will be rulers that will rule with justice. And you might say, well, what about Judas Iscariot? Doesn't that mean there's only 11 of them? Well, read the book of Acts, where it was chosen that a replacement for Judas Iscariot should be found. Maybe you can look it up and tell me his name for next week. Or if you don't like him, you could also go for Paul. But symbolically, that's less persuasive. So a king will reign in righteousness, and his disciples will have a role to play. And those who call themselves Christians today, who are truly following God, we are disciples as well. And so we have a role to play. And it says here also that even then there will be fools who speak folly. Verse 6 in chapter 32, their hearts are bent on evil. They practice ungodliness and spread error concerning the Lord. It's almost like God knew that YouTube was coming, you know. Bad teaching about God. Don't listen to preachers who tell you that you will always be well, that you will always be rich. I've done too many funerals for that to be true. The majority of people that we bury or cremate in a Baptist church are people that have belonged to our congregation. We don't get many requests from outside. But nobody lives forever. And when they do, they don't have huge amounts of money to take with them, because you all know that you can't take it with you. So fools speak folly, and they spread error concerning the Lord. They leave the hungry empty, and they withhold water from the thirsty. It's often said that in our world there is enough to share. But there are many countries who don't have enough. And so in our wisdom we created things like socialism and communism, which interestingly, socialism never quite works and communism is horrendous. And corrupt men sharing everything equally is never going to happen, I'm afraid. But there is an alternative. In verse 8 of the passage that was read to us most recently, it says, "But the noble make noble plans, and by noble deeds they stand." What does it mean to be noble? Well, largely it means to be king-like or queen-like, I guess. Now, when we look at our country, I don't know if you've noticed, but we have a new king. Only time will tell whether he will behave in a noble fashion. You know, it is, I don't know about these things, but if you believe the legends of Robin Hood, and why not indeed, then you would find out that King Richard was a noble king, and King John was not a noble king. And not everybody who is called king is noble. And therefore we come back to verse 1 in this chapter 32, which says, "A king will reign in righteousness." Jesus. Now, our country has opted out of having an all-powerful king. And I think that is probably a wise decision. And with King Jesus, the righteous king, we must choose whether to follow him or not. The thing about following him is that it brings us out into the light of day. And in the light of day, the things we do can be seen. Now, as long as you are someone who is able to say, "I'm not always righteous, I do things wrong," and as long as those things that are done are not things that you choose to do willfully, then nobody should be particularly surprised about that. Christians do get things wrong, which is why in our communion service we allowed time for confession. We allowed time for silently saying to ourselves, "Tell God about the wrong things, which hopefully you have done. I know I have. And so we come to this place of who are we going to depend upon. Back in the day, the Israelites went to Egypt and they wound up in slavery. In Isaiah's day, when things weren't working well for them, they went back to Pharaoh and asked for assistance. Pharaoh was not a righteous king, either in the days of Joseph or in the days of Isaiah. Jesus is always a righteous king. And therefore, in our day, if we want somebody to trust, that is the place we must go.